Hey guys, welcome to another Reaper blog video. Today I'm talking to Vijay Rathinam, all the way from India over Skype and TeamViewer, and he's going to show us his template and show us all kinds of tips. Thank you, Vijay, for joining me and for teaching the Reaper blog audience today.
Thank you, John. I've been a big follower of your Reaper blog. I learned Reaper, through watching your videos. It has supported me to learn a lot. And, thank you for having me on the show.
So in this video, we're going to be looking at your template. Can you show us your template, your starting point for if you are designing sounds for a film or trailer?
I have two layouts for, I'm using two layouts currently. One, if I want to deliver in Pro Tools. The other one, if I choose to mix it in Reaper. This is the template that I'm using for delivering in Pro Tools. So basically, in Reaper, there is no track classification. I mean, you can use mono, stereo, surround, any audio material in any track because Reaper just considers everything as items. But if you want to take this Reaper project into Pro Tools, I'm using AATranslator for taking it into Pro Tools. Let's say now this is a stereo track, but I've set this group to be mono only. And when you're using mono track, you need to have the panner in Reaper set to balance panner. And if you are using a stereo track, you need to set the panner as a dual pan. The reason for that is if I have this stereo track playing here in a balance panel track, and if I export this through AATranslator and play it in Pro Tools, then Pro Tools plays this at plus 6.02 dB louder than what it's supposed to be.
Okay.
That's mainly that's because of the pan law and the way the dual panner and the balance panner work. In balance panner, if you switch it to the right, you're actually when I switch this, like for example, when I'm using a balance panner and if I'm automating like this, what really happens is I'm losing the left channel completely. I'm only getting the right channel. But whereas on a dual panner track, like here, when I open the track pan, I get two, which is how Pro Tools is structured. Like if I open Pro Tools, okay. So, well, anyway, this is my Pro Tools template. So if you look at the stereo panner in Pro Tools, stereo tracks panner in Pro Tools, it has dual panner. And if you look at the mono track, it's a balance panner.
Yeah.
So which is why I'm following that same methodology in Reaper. So I set all my stereo tracks. Wherever I'm going to have stereo content, I'm going to keep the panner as dual panner, and wherever I'm going to have mono items, I'm going to have the track panner set as a balance panner. Let's say I'm cutting room tones for this particular scene, and this is a room tone which I would want to go to the center channel in Pro Tools. So I would just hit M. Well, I've assigned it to M, but basically what I'm doing is take channel mode downmix mono. So then it becomes a mono channel. So whatever I cut in this group are going to be mono downmixed track. For a typical scene, I would possibly do, let's say, a mono room tone, and then maybe, I would do a stereo room tone. This is going to LNR, and here I'm using the Anymix panner set to halfway kind of thing. It's going to quad basically.
Mm-hmm.
And for surrounds, I cut maybe another room tone. So let's say if I'm doing a small interior scene, I would do this. So when I take it to Pro Tools, I will have one mono track and two stereo tracks, and I would just drag and drop them, the mono track in this group, the stereo track in this group, The first 4 tracks, I set it up for front. So if you see my Reaper template, the first 4 tracks are routed to L and R. So if I solo and play this, it's coming out of L and R. And if I play this one, it's coming out of the quad at that kind of setting. So what I would do is after finishing editing in Reaper, when I take it to Pro Tools, I set the first 4 tracks just like that. And the last 4 tracks, I have kept it at halfway kind of thing. That's the pan position that I have on those tracks. So basically, what I would do is I would capture automation and I would put it like that. So throughout these tracks, throughout the content of the film, I have these tracks playing at that pan position. That's how I do it for backgrounds. Let's say if I want something moving between left, center, and right, I would simply use this pan, and I would just pan it any way I want, left or right. And that pan would translate into Pro Tools. It will translate here. So that way I'm doing all the LCR pans. I'm doing all the left, center, right pans on the Reaper track panner. And if I want to move anything from front to rear, what I would do, let's say backgrounds, I normally don't have a lot of stuff going from front to rear or from rear to front. If I do have something moving from front to rear, then I put it in a group which I call it surround. I use the ISONO panner for all the surround pans. If I have something moving from front to rear, what I would do is automate this the way I want. Put it in touch. Automate this the way I want. And once I'm done with this, I would render this new take, and it becomes a surround file.
Okay.
So those items would be placed in this group, which is for all the moving stuff. So these tracks are totally for static stuff, whatever things that are static, and whatever things that are moving from left to right, but mostly in the front, but not at the back. So if I have something moving from front to rear or rear to front or anything apart from the LCR, then I use a separate group for that, and I put all of them here. The pan plugin that I'm using can also upmix. So let's say if I have a room tone which I want upmixed to surround, so I would just use that and just upmix it and use the divergence and use the stage width and see how it sounds, if I like what it sounds like, and then I would just render them as new take, and it makes a surround file.
Excellent.
The same goes for sound effect as well. So up here, BG A to BGD, all of these are background tracks. And then starting from here, FXA to FXD, all of these are FX tracks. Let's say, for example, I have a door, or someone, someone's mobile phone is ringing, or someone's shooting gunshots, bullets, whiz-bys, ricochets, all that kind of stuff. I use FXA to D. And here again, FXA and B are monogroups. So you can see my pans are set as balance pan, and then FXC is a stereo group where my tracks are set to dual pan. And again, FXD is surround. So if I have some cars or vehicles like motorcycles, that sort of stuff, I would use these tracks and pan them accordingly and render them out as a surround file, and that goes in Pro Tools. So FXA is, if I have anything moving between LCR, again, I would use the track panner here, if there is anything moving between left, center, right, and if I have anything moving from front to rear or rear to front, or if I'm doing any surround panning per se, I would use these groups, and I would put the pan plugin on the item itself and do the pans and render them out as a surround file. And then these are my other groups. Here again, I have 4 tracks for front sound design elements like whooshes, drones, ascents, descents, that kind of stuff. And then I have another 4 tracks for the rear where I have the pan position set like this. This is just for audition. I'm not doing anything here. This is just for audition when I'm in Reaper. But when I go to Pro Tools, as I showed earlier, I would set these 4 tracks, from the beginning to end. I would set these 4 tracks, pan position, that kind of pan position. So these track 5, 6, and 7, 8 are hard panned always to that. So if I want anything moving, if I want, between left and right, of course I use it here. Sometimes I also, like, for example, let's say if I have a whoosh, which I want, let's say, let me take this whoosh. And if I want to pan this, what I would use sometimes, if it's a stereo track, I actually pan it on the clip like that. So when I render, it goes on the track. And the material I have in Pro Tools is already panned. Right. So I don't have to touch it. So I use clip pans on stereo items, and in mono items, I use the track pan.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Those 2 first sets of tracks that you showed us, they're basically set the same way. So there was the backgrounds, was it A to D? The first was mono, yeah. Second was stereo, the third was for the rear tracks, and the fourth was for things that move.
Yeah, so basically the first 8 tracks in my template, the background A is all mono, and they're all for L, C, and R, depending on where I want them to be placed. And all those pans happen in the track pan.
Then on the stereo tracks, you have 4 stereo tracks with the stereo pan, the dual pan.
Yeah.
And if you're panning things, you can do it on the items.
Items, yeah.
Yeah.
And they're all kept in front.
And you typically render those items before sending off to Pro Tools?
Sending it to Pro Tools, yes, correct.
Okay.
And then for the rear, again, I cut stereo tracks for rear. And if I want something moving between left rear to right rear, and then again, I use the clip pan, the item pan, take pan. Take pan is the correct word, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I use the take pan on those items, and then I render them. So then I have another group which is called Sweeteners. So in these groups, what I normally cut is basically constant noise. Let's say you have a scene in a park. You would cut some wind, some trees, some leafy trees, and maybe some bird tweets here and there. Like a constant bird tweet kind of thing, and then maybe some distant traffic. All those kind of constant noise that throughout the scene, I will cut it in these tracks. And then the next group I have is BGC, is basically what I call sweeteners, background sweeteners. Let's say if I'm in a park, the scene is set in a park, so I have traffic and all that happening in the previous groups. And then let's say I want to cut in some kids playing in distance, but I don't want the kids playing at distance, throughout the scene. Maybe if there's a gap between dialogue, I might want to hear some kids playing there, and then I would take it away. And then wherever there is something, when there's nothing happening on, there's a gap in the action. So that's where I cut in these kind of sweeteners. Maybe I would use a horn at, like vehicle horns, or maybe I would use a siren.
Yeah.
At distance in reverb, it's traveling far away, that kind of stuff. So I call these background sweeteners. So I put them in a separate group. So it's not a part of the noise, but it's like kind of sweetening the noise. So for that, I have 8 tracks, which I use for L and R. And then I have the same kind of sweeteners for the rear as well.
Okay.
That's BGC. And then the 4th group I have is basically the surround ambiences. Sometimes there are some really nice libraries, especially with the Pro Sound Effects master library. You get a lot of ambisonic recordings, which you can decode to whatever format you want. And there are some nice surround recordings in Pro Sound Effects master library. Some Sound Ideas library have some good surround recordings. There are a lot of people who are doing a lot of nice surround recordings in the independent sound library business as well. So if
you
I want
use
to
use those tracks if they start out as 5.1.
Yeah, 5.1. Yeah. This group is exclusively for surround tracks. Or if I find a track which is nice, which is stereo, but I might want to upmix that using one of these plugins. Now, Waves has a good upmixing plugin. Iasono plugin has a good upmixing thing.
So do you upmix it on the stereo track and then move it down to the surround?
No, I mean, if you see these tracks are only routed to 1 and 2. If you see here,
Okay.
this is, well, it says 1 to 4, but it's actually routed to the quad. These tracks are routed to 1 and 2 only. If you see the routing, well, it says 6. I don't know why it says 6, but it should not. Because these are all stereo tracks, so I can set it to L2, I think. If I do that, then all of these tracks are routed to, track channels 1 and 2.
Okay.
And again, these tracks should also be set to 2 channels. They're all going to the bus, and the bus is routed to the 6th channel. And that's where I have the pan plugin, Iasono pan plugin, and it is set this way. The last thing that I want to talk about is the LFE. I don't like to use LFE send through a surround panel or something because, well, this is a habit that I got from working with Pro Tools. The problem with Pro Tools is I have all the tracks set to 5.0, not to 5.1, mainly because, so if I set this to 5.1 output, you have this LFE send in Pro Tools, but this is post fader. The LFE send in Pro Tools is post fader. So if I have an item here, and if I send the LFE through this, and if I increase the volume, the LFE volume also goes up naturally, which is something I don't like personally. So I want to have control over my low end. So I started I started having all these tracks routed to 5 channel instead of the 5.1. And then I started making a separate track where I cut in low frequency effects. Like, if there's an explosion or something, I have explosion going on in the center channel and maybe in L and R as well. If I want a big impact, then I would use all the LCR, all the screen channels for explosions. So I would use one track of explosion in the center and another track of explosion in left and right. And I would use low frequency effect filtered. And then I have an EQ here where, I tweak it the way I wanted. So I started getting into that habit of constructing a separate low frequency effects channel because it gave me more control over how I wanted. Sometimes I would use pink noise in it because it's just rumble. For bass drops and things like that, I would use like a square wave or a sine wave and kind of make like a tape stop effect, which gives that kind of a bass drop feel. That's what I found Reaper to be really useful because, I could just dial in some hit like drum hit or something like that. Let me show you what I mean. Like drum or a taiko, something like that. Taiko hit. So I can have a taiko, something that cut in the LFE track. And if I want to make like a bass drop or something, stretch markers are really cool for this kind of thing. So I would use a stretch marker and make sure I have this preserve pitch turned off. And I would do something like this, which would make like a very nice bass drop.
Yeah, for sure.
So yeah, so these kind of things are what made me start editing in Reaper. And sometimes I can pitch shift this like really crazy. I can make a really high frequency sound and make it completely different, put a ton of reverb on it, and I can just work without having to get bogged. I mean, like if I'm trying to do this in Pro Tools, I would have to open up so many plugins. If I want to keep it in the track non-destructively, then I need to have a different plugin for this, or I would have to have a separate design session where I do all these kind of things and then bounce out from there and bring it into my main session. So I found that time consuming. But whereas in Reaper, because it's all non-destructive and I keep everything, whatever I do, I'm not bogged down to one particular set of plugins. I use waves, I use fab filters, plugins, reverbs. I use Valhalla reverbs. I use exponential audio reverbs, the waves reverbs, Altiverb. I'm free to do what I want because it's clearly a very free, open kind of platform. So similarly, again, for LFE, I use these two tracks, but they're bussed to this folder. And in this folder, I have this, 150. Some people keep it at 120. I like to keep it at 150. That's it. That's my template. If I want to take it to Pro Tools, but then I have another template, which is pretty similar. That is, if I decide to mix in Reaper, and here again I have a set of mono tracks. Well, for this I actually don't have to bother if I'm deciding to mix in Reaper. I don't have to follow this layout as mono tracks and stereo tracks, but I'm so used to this kind of workflow because most of the time I deliver in Pro Tools. So maybe later on during the process I might decide, okay, I want to deliver Pro Tools. So if that is the case, I can still render them and use AATranslator and convert into Pro Tools session and deliver. So which is why I still follow this mono stereo layout thing. The only difference between mixing in Pro Tools and mixing in Reaper, if I'm using this template where I'm delivering in Pro Tools, these panners, I can use them. And if I have the panner set like this in Reaper, when I translate that through AATranslator in Pro Tools, when I have a track kept, if the pan position is like this, and if it is, it naturally goes to the center channel. But whereas in Reaper, if you have this, Reaper still defaults to 1 and 2.
Yeah.
So it doesn't actually go to the center channel. So what I've done is I've routed all of these to this folder. And in the folder track, I set the track channels as 4, and I pan them to the left. So it goes to the third channel of the 5.1 bus, which is the center channel in Reaper. So in this case, all these tracks and the track panners are basically dummy. So whatever I do, it's routed to the group, and the group is going to the third channel. Yeah. So this group,
no panning on those tracks.
No panning on those tracks. So basically, these are the tracks that I cut elements here only if I want to pan at dead center. And then again, these tracks are routed to L and R. So if I want to do any panning, the problem is if I do a panning on this, like on the item or on the track itself, what really happens is it jumps from left to right and it doesn't go through center. Sometimes we may have a car coming in and we would want to pan it from, maybe a car passed by on screen. So we would want to have the car pass by from left to center and then it goes away to the right. But if you use this panner, or if you use the item panner, the take pan, what happens is it skips the center channel and it goes from left to right directly, which sounds a little odd in a surround room. So I would not do that kind of panning here. But if I want to pan something fully to the left, I would use the take pan. And if I want to pan something completely to the right, then I would use the take pan.
For those moving effects, you need to use a surround plugin.
Track. Yeah. So again, these tracks again are routed to 1 and 2, and that goes to this folder. And here I have again the Anymix panner, and I have this stationary in that zone. So I will again use this for backgrounds. It's similar to what I showed you earlier. Here, exactly like that. And the same goes for Sweeteners. For these kind of Sweeteners, I try to stay away from the center, because center is where the dialogue happens. So I try not to clutter the center channel with these kind of kids playing in the background or siren or stuff like that. So I try to keep them in stereo tracks, either routed to left and right, or whether either pan to left or hard right, or maybe have a little bit of bleed in the center too. And then again, the rear channels, I have the same kind of thing for rear. And if I want any of the background tracks, maybe if I have a car passing by in the background on screen, then what I would do is I would cut it here. Let's say, let's cut in auto by. Let's say I have this car. And if I want this pan from right to left, I would use the isono panner. Use the rotation here. That's a good way to pan it. So I can start, I can pan it. That's surround. So let's say I want this to come from surround and go to the center. So then I would pan it like that. So it pans. I keep it like this, or I render them. Sometimes the mix stage might not have the same plugin, so I render that. So it stays like a surround track. So that's what I do for backgrounds. And then again, for sound effects, these tracks are just mono, which are dead center. And then I hard route that to a folder track. And in the folder track, I have effects. Instead, I can still set it to 2 channel, but the parent channel should be 3 and 4. And I set it to left.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So whatever I cut in this is dead center. These pans don't matter. And
you have a group of 8 tracks for mono effects that goes into a folder which sums everything to mono, just to make sure it's mono, and then routes it to output 3.
Yeah, output 3.
Is that another group of effects for mono?
Yeah, another group of mono, because most of the stuff we cut in center. It's like what the character does, whatever the character does.
Okay.
So sometimes I need more tracks. I mean, this is just a template. So when I finish it, the number of tracks that I use per reel might change. So once I do, I just remove all the empty tracks.
Okay.
So that's what I've done in the trailer. If you see, you might not have the same number of tracks. Like you see effects on the C, which is stereo group, I only have 7 now because I've removed one of them, which is empty. But for sound design, I have more tracks in trailer because it's a trailer, and I have more of these impacts and whooshes and that kind of stuff going on. So I have more tracks here. So that's what I do for this. And then here again, as I showed, this is a stereo track. This is mainly for left and right channels. And then I have FXD, which is if I want to use left, center, and right. If I have an effect where I want it moving between left, center, and right, or front to rear, or any surround pans, I use in this group, and I pan with the plugin on the item itself.
Okay.
And then again, whooshes and stuff for the front channels, and whooshes and stuff for the rear channels, and then the LFE group. Here I have the LFE group routed to a bus, and I have the same filter going on here. So this is what I have in the trailer that I'm showing you today. So the other thing I wanted to touch about is if I'm mixing in Reaper, because I'm using Reaper, not everybody is using Reaper here. It's still a Pro Tools world. I don't think it's going to change anytime soon. They both are great apps for what they are, they both can coexist in my creative world. So I like to use the best of both worlds. I don't force my fellow mix engineers to mix in Reaper, but they also, the people who I work with, they also are familiar with Reaper and they're using Reaper. So what is happening now is if I decide to mix them in Reaper, we're not mixing everything in Reaper. The cool thing about Reaper is Reaper can run as ReWire Slave with Pro Tools. So you see in my Pro Tools template, I have these set of tracks which are for Reaper. So I have an LNR, a left surround, right surround, and a center and LFE. I have it set up like this because the surround configuration in Reaper is S5.1 SMPTE, which is left, right, center, LFE, left surround, and right surround. But whereas the 5.1 configuration in Pro Tools is something called 5.1 film, which is L, CR, LS, RS, and LFE. Technically, if you want, I can create a 5.1 instrument track, and if I insert a multi-mono Reaper plugin, then it will give me 5.1 audio. What happens is the channels are upside down.
Yeah.
If you want. So I don't do this. Instead, I make a separate stereo for LNR and a separate stereo for LS and RS, which are the quad pair. And then for the center, I have a mono ReWire plugin. And for the LFE, I have a mono ReWire plugin. In the mix stage, I just activate these and open Reaper after I open Pro Tools.
Yeah.
Then my Pro Tools and Reaper, they're running in sync. I might have the Foley tracks playing in Pro Tools, but I have all the edited effects tracks playing from Reaper. And then I have dialogue and music playing from Pro Tools. So it gives me flexibility to have best of both worlds.
Yeah.
This if I decide to mix in Pro Tools and Reaper. I also mix some of my projects. Not all of my projects, but some of my projects, I'm also a part of the mix team. So if that is the case, I would then use Reaper, rewired Pro Tools. And then I'm working on some projects where I'm not a part of the mix team. I'm editing and supervising the sound editorial, but handing over to some other people for mixing. And in those kind of scenarios, I have to, because they might not be comfortable with Reaper, handling tracks with Reaper. Then in that case, I edit in the other template, which I showed you earlier on, and convert it through AATranslator and deliver. So if you want to see how the conversion in AATranslator work, maybe I can show you quickly. Let me cut in a couple of tracks, just some random track. Let me make this a stereo track, dual pan, and that's a mono track. So, but you have to follow this strictly if you decide to take it to Pro Tools. Otherwise, it really messes up your workflow. So anyway, so if this is the case, and if I decide to automate this, and automation items is not yet supported in AATranslator. So if you decide to use an automation item, what I would do is after I do whatever I want, just right click, preserve points, and then use AATranslator. For now, I think AATranslator, they're doing a good job, and I think they're going to do that soon. So here I've done some volume automation. The clip gain works. I've kept it at minus 10 dB, and here again at minus 7 dB. And then I use the track planner like so. So let me do some volume automation, and bingo, done. And now I save this wherever I want. Reaper blog AAT. The other big advantage that I'm using Reaper is when I spot from SoundMiner to Reaper, I'm not actually copying the files into the project directory. What I'm doing is referencing from my sound library hard drive. just convert this project right now through AATranslator, it would just show 0 files because none of the files exist inside the Reaper project directory. I'll show you one more thing. Let's say if I cut this and if this is muted, so I want this item to be muted in Pro Tools as well.
Right. Okay.
Okay. So if I select all and hit render, then all these files gets copied into your project directory.
Mm-hmm.
The reason why you can actually do this by right-click and copy, but the problem is if I copy, I might have a file which is 96. I might have a file which is 44. The sample rate conversions is not handled by AATranslator. So before you put it through AATranslator, you have to make sure every single file is of the same sample rate that you want your delivery to be in. So in the film post world, it's 48 and 24. So to make all the files 48 and 24, I rendered them all. So if I have a plugin here for this item, and if I render this like this, then it makes it a stereo track because the plugin is a stereo plugin.
Yeah.
Which I don't want. I want to have the plugin applied, but I want to apply it as mono. I want it to stay as mono. So the render that I'm using is render preserve source type. Preserve source type. Render items new take preserve source type. So if you use that, I've set it to Control, Option, Command, and click on the media item. Then it renders it and keeps it as mono, even if you have some plugins on some items.
Okay.
Which is normally the case when I'm rendering, because I do have some effects there. So I just select all the tracks and click render item, new take, preserve source tapes. But the problem is if you render a muted item, there is no audio there, which is something I don't want. So I made a custom action. I select only the muted items first, and then go unmute them, and then I render them, and then I mute them back again. So even if I have, let's say I have 2 items, and this is muted, this is muted. Let's say this part is muted. Now, if I hit select muted item, it selects all the muted items in my project, and I unmute them, render them, and mute them back again. And then I select all the unmuted items. It leaves those muted items, and then I render these separately. So this is 2 things that I have to do. And once I do this, I select all, I right-click, and I crop to active take. So the underlying take disappears. When I do this, I always do a save as. I only do this when I'm just about to transfer everything into Pro Tools. So once I finish a reel, I make a save as, and I call that for Pro Tools, and I do all these things on that project. So if I still want to tweak something, I can still go back to my old project and do it because all the takes still exist there. So once I complete, whatever I do in Reaper and I render all of them and I crop to active takes only, then I open up AATranslator, find that project, select that. In source, I have Reaper project and export to. I set it up PTX. Now AATranslator, before it was only doing PTF. Now it can do PTX, which means the clip gains, the take volume, everything can translate perfectly. So I select PTX as my destination, and it chooses, look for source media in. So, all my source media is in the same project folder. So I select that. And where do I want the output to? The output I normally create in the same folder which has the RPP. This sample rate and frame rate, it only sets the Pro Tools session sample rate or frame rate.
Right. It doesn't convert any files.
Yeah. It doesn't convert any files. So I just select that, set that, and I don't like to split stereo. I like to keep it as mono. The only problem you have is if I have this mono item on a stereo track like this, then AATranslator will split the stereo track. and it gets messy when you go into Pro Tools, which is why I always would advise you to keep mono tracks as mono, and you have to allocate certain tracks as mono and certain tracks as stereo. And then I go to AATranslator, hit convert, and it's done. So if I open the same folder, there should be a Pro Tools session. I recently saw a video sometime back in YouTube where they show when they launched Pro Tools, and then they launched Reaper, and then quit Reaper, relaunch Reaper again, and quit Reaper and relaunch Reaper again.
Then it was like 32 times. Yeah.
Yeah, 32 times before Pro Tools is launched. 12 is not that bad. It's pretty fast. Okay, so now you have these items muted. This is -7 dB, and if you go to Reaper, clip gain is -7 dB. This is -10 dB, and it is -10 dB in clip gain. And the fades are preserved, item names are preserved, everything is preserved.
And automation?
Automation, yeah, your volume automation. So if I show all automation, I have a button here. I have volume automations. So those volume automations came out. And then if I click the pan automation, this is the pan automation that I did. And in Reaper, it's there. And it's 100% accurate. And because I'm doing surround projects, I just drag all these tracks and move it to my template. You remember I showed you my template?
Yep.
So depending on, let's say these 8 tracks are my mono groups. So I just drag and put the respective groups in my Pro Tools session. So, finally it is still in the layout.
Yeah. But you could probably do the import session data directed to this, the converted file, and choose which tracks it goes onto as well.
I can do that, yes. I can do that, but I prefer to doing it this way.
Okay.
It's much simpler. I find this much simpler. So, as I said, this is a stereo project. What AATranslator creates is a stereo project. But what I was going to show you is, so if I route this to 5.1 output, you see the pan automation here is still there.
Mm-hmm.
And so whatever automation I did is still there. And if you leave it at default position, it is normally in the center channel. So when you're editing in Reaper, you will not hear it in the center channel in a 5.1 room. You will hear it, whatever tracks I put it here. You understand what I mean?
Yeah, you'll hear it in 1 and 2 unless you modify your template to send it only to output 3.
Yeah, exactly. But when you're editing, you will hear it not in the center channel. It's a little bit weird. In small rooms, it's okay, but in large rooms, you might have a problem working in a template like this and then taking it to Pro Tools. But once you take it into Pro Tools, it plays in the center channel.
Let's do one more quick thing. And it's something you showed me before. Can you show us how to do a downmix to stereo to monitor a 5.1 session in a stereo room?
Okay. So this is a 5.1 Reaper project. So what I would do is I use a plugin. The plugin that I use is Mixdown 5.1. In this one, there is a preset, which is what I use, the Stereo ITU. And I set the LFE to -10. It really depends on how much of LFE that you're putting in. So for this current trailer, I would recommend -10. This is one way of doing it. The way that we do in Pro Tools is this. What I would do is use this plugin from Avid called the Downmixer, which is basically folding it down into a stereo track, making a 5.1 track to a stereo track. And I can route it to the stereo monitor. They have some presets, but anyway, the left is routed at 0 to the left channel, and the center is routed at -3 following the pan law, and it is routed to the left and the right of the stereo pair, and then the right is routed to the right of the stereo pair, and the left surround is routed to the left of the stereo pair at -6 dB. Of course, all these depends on how much of content you put in what channels, but this is a basic preset that can work. If you have a project which is surround heavy, I wouldn't recommend this. I would tell you that you have to play the content and move the faders and do your own downmix. But if you're using my kind of template and my way of editing for my project, this works most of the time because I try not to overdo the surround so much. I try to keep the focus on the screen as much as possible, but you would still have some content floating around in the surrounds. So my surrounds, the left surround is routed to the left at -6 dB, and the right surround is routed to the right of the stereo pair at -6 dB. And the LFE, here I have it -3. Sometimes, depending on how much of LFE, like for example, the trailer that I've sent you, I would do -10, not -3, because that's pretty heavy LFE going on there in that trailer. So depending on the content, I would do that. If you want to do that in Reaper without such plugin, I don't know how to do it. So
okay, I actually do, because I did this morning. So there's a JS plugin called 8x mono to 1x stereo mixer.
Ah, cool. Yeah. So yeah.
So just set level 3 you would put at -6 or -3. Level 4 is the LFE. You set that at -10 for this project. The other ones you leave the same, and then pan 3 you put at 0.5. Pan 4 you put at 0.5. And I believe that was correct.
Yeah, I think
the same as
what you
said. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That makes sense.
Set the master track to a 2-channel out instead of 6.
2-channel out. Yeah. I mean, this will help you to if you're editing something. I mean, to maybe if you're mobile or somewhere, maybe if you're on a laptop, and if you want to open a surround edited session and want to listen to it on a pair of headphones, I think I do this sometime. Mm-hmm. Sometimes I'm somewhere and suddenly somebody calls me and say, "Oh, can you send only this track?" Or stuff like that. So suddenly, if I want to do that, I open my laptop. I do this kind of thing all the time. Yeah.
You also showed me something in your interface mixer. If you wanted to do it just in the monitoring.
So that I'm using the Scarlett, the Focusrite Scarlett interface, but doing this way in this interface, that wouldn't actually give you a render. If I render it as a stereo, it wouldn't give me a render. It would still give me a 5.1.
Right. Doing it as a plugin would, and doing it in your interface monitoring is just a way to downmix in monitoring. Yeah. Without modifying your session. So.
Yeah, session.
Probably depends on the day what you need to do. Really.
Exactly. You can do the same thing, whatever you showed. 1 and 2 is going to your left and right speakers. The third channel coming out of Reaper is going into both. If I route it this way, it's going to the left speaker. And if I do it right that way, it goes to the center speaker and, to the right speaker. So I route the center channel to both at -3. And then the LFE on the surrounds, again, I send the surrounds as the left channel to left and the right channel to right, left surround to the left and the right surround to the right. And the LFE, I send it at whatever volume I want. And if that's all going to your monitoring 1 and 2, I'm sure a lot of interfaces has this kind of a virtual mixer these days. I know RME has that because I have that in one of my other rooms.
Yeah.
And then
M Audio and Focusrite and Persona, almost all of them will have that.
Yeah, all of them.
Everything except for the Avid stuff, probably.
Yeah. Yeah. So all these interfaces come with this kind of built-in mixer kind of thing. So where you can do this kind of thing and listen to it in stereo if you want. But again, as I said earlier, if you're using it, it's like using an external mixer to try to do that. But if you do that, you're only changing the way you monitor, not the project itself. But if you want to deliver a stereo mix from a 5.1, I mean, either you use the waves or you use this plugin. But actually, I would suggest this plugin because this plugin has more control than the waves. Now I've seen this because you have this is exactly like what Pro Tools has, where you have volume controls. Sometimes if I have, maybe in a scene you might have a lot of surround elements. If something is going crazy, like an earthquake scene or like a building falling down, then you might want to use a lot of surrounds. So for those scenes, you might want to automate this. Maybe for those scenes, you might want to pull down the surrounds even further or maybe push up. Maybe if you don't have so much going on in surrounds, you might want to push up so that it also comes through in the stereo mix. And if you have too much going on in the surrounds, you might want to pull it down for your stereo mix. So I would suggest using this plugin, more waves on, because in the waves, it doesn't have the volume control. So I would say I normally do the stereo down mixes from Pro Tools, and that's the plugin that we use, and it has similar volume controls like the one that you just showed.
Yeah.
So if I'm doing it in Reaper, now I know this is a better option. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Well, I've never looked at it before today, and I never needed to, but it seems to work great.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, I think that's a good place for us to end the video for today. Thank you so much for showing all these tips and tricks. I've learned a ton. I'm sure the audience has as well. There's a lot more than people would expect. Even just creating the template, all the details of how things need to be on the pans and how and why you do everything. It's really interesting. Thank you so much for sharing this information.
Thank you, John. Thank you.
All right, guys, that's it for this video. There'll be links to everything relevant in the description of this video. I'll try to put as much of this information into text form as well. Thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Follow me on Facebook and Twitter. Support the Reaper blog through Patreon. Visit reaperblog.net for a lot more tutorials.